skies will be filled with the greatest air armada the world has ever seen. Our own Army Air Forces, the best planes ever built, 65,000 planes this year. And by the time you finish your training, America will have overwhelming superiority in the air.
David Davey Tokyo Jones was not just a hero, he was a leader. Some of you probably know people like this, but this man was incredibly special. He never needed to be recognized, and he was very modest about what he did. And when you hear to the end of his story, I think you will be amazed what he was doing at NASA. He was born in 1913 in Oregon, grew up there, and at age 18 attended the University of Arizona in Tucson. It was there that he joined the National Guard. He finished his education from 1932 to 1936 and then joined the cavalry. Think of that. How long ago was that? He was there and then decided he wanted to go to the Army Air Forces and joined. He started his pilot training in 1937 and finished in 1938. At that time, he was flying a Northrop A-17. Now, I didn't know what that plane looked like, so I had to look it up. It had 2 wings. It was, it was not really very remarkable. The landing gear was a 3-piece landing gear, and he flew that for a while until he became a member of the 17th Bombardment Group. They were watching the west coast of the United States and looking to make sure that there was nothing going on. They flew missions every day. They were also trying to prevent any submarines from coming near our country. In 1941, they were supplied with B-25s. Now, why is that important? Well, that bomb group became the best, the most experienced B-25 flyers. One day, I should use my slides. I get so excited about talking, I forget. Just ask my husband. I'm going to give you a little context about about the attack on Pearl Harbor. We were negotiating, the Japanese were negotiating with us, but it wasn't going well. We wanted them to give up China, Indonesia, which was Vietnam, and they refused. Our Secretary of State told them that they were going to give up China, Indonesia, and Manchuria, and that all of their relationships with unwanted military were going to stop. Well, you can imagine the Japanese said, that's not going to happen. I don't know that they said it, but that's what they thought. At that time, in the late 1930s and in 1941, their government was a military dictatorship. Even their imperial leader, he followed what the military told him to do, even though he did not think it was in the best interests of the civilians that lived in his country. So the government was really in charge. We had embargoes against Japan. No steel, no rubber. And the United States provided 80 to 90% of their oil, and we cut it off. What that meant is that if they went to war, they had 6 months and maybe a year to wage war, but they had to win. If they, they took care of it, they used it wisely, they may have gone 18 months to 2 years. And so the decision was made that they would attack Pearl Harbor. Oruku Yamamoto, who went to college at Harvard in the United States, he really was not too excited hearing that his government, the military, wanted to attack Pearl Harbor. But he was charged with creating that mission. Because he lived in the United States, he is said to have said, and we can't verify it, that by going to war with the United States or an attack on the United States is like waking a sleeping, it's not tiger, a sleeping giant. That's it. I knew that word. Age is so great, And what we know as Pearl Harbor occurred on December 7th, 1941. I'm going to tell you a story that you weren't going to get today, but a gentleman that I spent a lot of time with, he was at Pearl Harbor. He had a 24-hour duty, and that was on a fire truck. And he and the fireman and another gentleman were standing there getting orders on what they were going to do that day. They were going to stay on the flight line. And all of a sudden, a Japanese plane came over the top of them. And the other guy was just swearing and cussing. Well, they clipped the cable that connected the Pacific Fleet to the mainland. And all of a sudden, there were planes coming in on them. They jumped on the fire engine and finally ended up right across the bay from all of our battleships. There was the Arizona right in front of them. The firemen left these two guys. Really, they were trying to survive. And all of a sudden, they saw the Arizona come up out of the water, break in half, and go down. And then they were trying to get those that were injured out of the water. His name was Mel Heckman, and quite an interesting man. We really were not prepared for Pearl Harbor. And not only did they attack Pearl Harbor, which was horrific, but they attacked all over the Pacific because they had this idea of taking control of the entire Pacific. It was a sphere of prosperity that they needed to build, and they were needing the natural resources in order to do that, and those countries had it. My husband's back there telling me I should press the button, but I knew I was gone blank, Jerry, thank you. But in the Pacific, the attacks that occurred on December 8th, 1941, it was the same day as December 7th, but anyone who was in the Pacific will tell you it was December 8th. And they fought, and many surrendered right away. But those who were on the Philippines fought for months and months and months. On Bataan, all of those men, all of our military, were fighting with World War I issued artillery, equipment, and ammunition. It was a losing battle for them, and every one of them had at least 3 diseases, many related to starvation, malaria, dengue fever, and just dysentery. They were miserable. When they were surrendered, and I want you to hear, were surrendered because they did not want to give up, but they were forced to surrender. Their lives changed dramatically. Back to Pearl Harbor, you can see and read yourself. But after Pearl Harbor, Nimitz came And he was being taken around and told it's just horrible, it's the most horrible thing that's happened. What can you see? And Nimitz said it was a bad attack. If you looked over there, there were the huge containers, huge containers of fuel that they didn't destroy. If they had, it would take a long time for us to get fuel back to the Pacific Fleet. Secondly, there were all of the areas where they could fix the battleships. They could move them across the water and not send them back to the mainland to repair them. And because they didn't destroy the dry docks, they did us a favor. And there's lastly, we'll skip that one. But anyway, he knew, it'll come to me and I'll just bring it back. Suddenly I'll scream it out to you to go, oh my God, she's talking about that now? But Nimitz knew that we had a chance. I know this is not part of that, but they wanted our aircraft carriers, and they didn't get them. They were all out on the water. The third thing that I just remembered was that they bombed and attacked Pearl Harbor on a Sunday. Now, on Sundays, all the ships are in. Where do you think all the crews are? Not aboard ship. And so there were 2,400 killed. Had they been in open water, it would have been more like 24,000 people killed. Our president, he was distraught, well, obviously, over Pearl Harbor, but the whole country was distraught. And he needed them to know that they were going to be okay, our country was going to be okay, and he wanted some way to get back at the Japanese. So it was sent out all across the military. And one day, there he is. He's signing the orders to declare war against the Japanese, but he really wanted to retaliate against them. The citizens deserved it. This is where Nimitz went and took a look and really found that it wasn't as bad. I mean, it was horrible, but it wasn't as bad as it could have been. Francis Lowe, he was in Norfolk, and he saw a number of B-25s flying, and he noticed how short their runway was. Not that it was as short as an aircraft carrier, but he thought, I wonder if that would be a way that we could retaliate. And he went to General King, who was his commander, and he gave him that idea, and he thought for sure he would say, bad idea. Nah, we're not going to do that. Instead, he embraced it. They started and built a plan, and they charged a man who was not really in the military, James Jimmy Doolittle, but he was in the military and became a colonel, and they charged him with doing the Doolittle raid. Here are B-25s. When they decided that was going to happen, that they were going to take B-25s off of an aircraft carrier, our newest, latest, and greatest was the Hornet. They told the 17th Bomb Group, they moved them across country from Oregon, where they were protecting our coast, and they were going to protect the coast on the east side. Little did they know that they were going to be asked to volunteer for a special mission, a very secret mission that could possibly change the war effort. Now, Davy Jones was one of the oldest pilots. He was born in 13. He got his pilot's wings in 38. So he was, late 20s, going to be in his 30s pretty soon. And he told this gentleman, and this is an older picture of him, Henry Miller, a lieutenant. He was a naval lieutenant, that he didn't believe this could happen, even though Miller provided him with all this literature that they could read, and it was true, and let's try it. So he went up in the air with Davy Jones, and he said, "You follow all of my instructions." And he said, "But it's going to be heavy. What are we going to, the weight, all of that, how are we going to do this?" And he followed his instructions, and I'll be darned, they launched. So Miller began training all of the pilots. They thought there were going to be 20 planes that did the Doolittle raid, but instead, it wasn't. So they sent 24 aircraft to have them adjusted, changed, all the things that were not needed taken out of the B-25s, and they sent them to Minnesota, where they altered those airplanes. They were going to need a new bladder in there, which would be extra fuel for them. They would take out the guns. There were no gunners in the back, even though they call him the gunner, but there were no gunners in the back. They sliced off handles of brooms and painted them black and stuck them out the back of the aircraft, making them think that there were guns, because there were none. He was so special to the Doolittle Raiders that he was on board the Hornet. He was there helping the crews, getting into their airplanes and wishing them well, and he watched them take off. He was actually an honorary Doolittle Raider because of his care of them, his knowledge, his information, his instruction. He just became one of their most important people. They were in California, and they loaded the ships on a certain day, and Davy Jones in his diary says, "Hate the ship." I mean, he hated being on board, because this was like the 7th, and they were going to be in the Pacific and near Japan, and so they were on the ship much too long for him. I think his stomach didn't like it. I think a lot of things bothered him, but he did not like their ship. While they were on there, they were, of course, trained all these things. It's like, oh, okay, come on, let's get on with it. And then on the 18th, the weather was horrific in the water. It was just pouring rain. The wind was blowing, and they had to align such that the winds were behind them, and the ship was listing up and down. So they had to pay attention that when the wind came behind them and the ship listed up, that's when they took off, which gave them a good point. But the problem was the commander told them to get off the ship 10 hours before they were supposed to. If they were going to get off the ship in, say 400 miles away from Japan, it'd be fine. They'd have all the fuel they needed to get to China. At 650 miles from Japan, it was dicey, and they knew there would be problems. But they got kicked off the ship at 810 miles away from. There was also a picket boat, a Japanese picket boat that saw them, and they relayed the message back to Japan. And so they needed to protect that whole unit, that one aircraft carrier that was with them, because we couldn't afford to lose any of it. Davey's in the air, the mic clicks on, and his gunner in the back says, "We don't have enough fuel." Jones replies, "That's right." Click. I didn't hear another word. They flew to Japan, and their mission was to hit Tokyo. They got lost. So they flew around a little bit. And Davey said when they flew over the city, people on the ground were waving at them. They were so low, the altitude was so low, and all these people are waving at them like they're their own airplanes. Little did they know that minutes later they'd be bombing them. And then they took off. When they got to China, or close to China, there was no fuel, there was no this, there was no that. They couldn't see, it was pitch black. And they dropped a flare, and it was mountainous, and they knew that wasn't good. Well, it came to the point where they had to bail out, in which they did. Davey gave the bailout message, and all 4 of his crew members bailed. Now, Davey was a little bit, the pilot always stays with the plane, but he was holding back. He said he never had fear like that before. And he said, as he's hanging out of that black hole, he says, blacker than your ass. He said, I held on with my fingernails, and I just couldn't let go. And then the winds and the movement of that aircraft just blew him off, and he went down. It wasn't the best landing, and it was cold, and he spent the night there. The next morning, he was up and moving. I mean, he had to because it was cold. There they are, taking off. There's Tokyo burning. And you can see the mileage. You can see the different, there's the Hornet. They go into, all those different cities. And then Chuchao is where they were going to meet up. Well, some planes ran out of fuel and landed on the coast of China. Some of them were captured. Some of them were beheaded. Some of them died in the water. One crew, I was with Bill Bauer, who was a Doolittle Raider. I went to his home in Boulder. And I had the street name, but I couldn't find the address, right? So I'm driving around Boulder, and I know I'm on the street, and all of a sudden, there's a mailbox with a prop from a World War II aircraft. Score, I'm home. So I went in and talked to Bill, and he said, I don't want to talk about the raid anymore. I want to be known as a humanitarian. He says, I'll give you a few questions to ask, and then let's have tomato soup and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And so I spent the day with Bill Bauer and was able to have peanut butter jelly sandwiches and tomato soup with him. He said, the question I asked him, I said, why would someone land on the coast? And he said, well, you tell me. You know, don't you? And I said, well, I think so. You hit that wet sand and it's like a brick wall. He says, exactly. Why would you land? Now, I don't think he was criticizing the pilot, but just the whole thought of landing on wet sand and stopping so incredibly fast. It'd throw somebody through the plexiglass window. It would, just all kinds of things would happen. There he is, Davey Jones. Isn't he a handsome guy? He's a big, tall fellow. It's kind of amazing. I'm going to read to you from his diary because I want to have it correct. On April 19th, got to railroad, there was Haas. Haas was his co-pilot, and he was the other big guy that was in the front in the photograph of the crew. A sight for sore eyes. After 6 hours walking, got handcart to next station. Then special train and ended up at Chuchin Chechil. There was a reception, hundreds of people, and we were finding most of the crews tired and sore. On April 21st, he said, "The bad news is starting to come in." They found 2 bodies out on the coast, 2 complete crews, okay, bodies 2 days in the water. Someone's got to go and identify the bodies. About a 20-day trip, mostly by foot. Looks like I'm the guy. Now, about 60 people accounted for. On April 24th, don't have to ID the bodies. Wired crews coming in to go back and ID the bodies, cremate them, and scatter the ashes. I mean, the difficulty of all of this, these men, I mean, now they were together anyway because they were in the same bomb group, but then they didn't know what kind of mission they were getting into, and they didn't know until they got on the ship. When I saw Davy Jones at his home, well, he lived in Air Force Village in Texas, I asked him, "Did you know where you were going?" And he said, "Well, I had to find maps of Japan at the National Archives, and they didn't have any. So I ended up going to the National Geographic Archive, and there they were." But he was in charge at that point of getting weather information, of getting what they were going to bomb. You know, they couldn't bomb the Imperial Castle or whatever it was. But he had to get all of those pieces so that they had the information for good data, really, for them to do the mission and know where they were going in Japan. On April 6th, Colonel and 20 others leaving tomorrow, leaving me here to clean up. And that was kind of Davy's thing. He was the cleanup guy. He took care of all of that for them, you know, counting the crews, knowing where they were. And his friend, his dear friend, never came in, and never came in, and never came in. And he readied himself to write a letter to his wife because he knew her. He knew her quite well. And then they learned that one of the Doolittle aircraft, one B-25, ended up in Vladivostok, and his buddy was on that aircraft. He was quite happy about that. On May 4th, he writes, "It's kind of funny being hunted, also very helpless, because they were in a cave at one point, and they moved them, they kept moving them, and they kept moving them, and you know, there were a lot of people that cared about them, and they were in the paper, and they were very well known, but still, they were always being hunted. The Japanese wanted them." And if you ever read books on DeShazer and some of the others who became missionaries after their opportunity to be a prisoner of war of the Japanese, you will understand it took a lot of forgiveness, it took a lot of care, and it took a lot of special people to be able to go back to Japan and want to even be around them and not kill them, truthfully. On May 14th, it's a happy day. Plane arrived at 10 a.m., learned that all raiders awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Doolittle made a general. Ski, his buddy, is alive and in Russia. Now, at one point, the raiders had dinner at Shanghai with Shanghai Shek and Madam Shanghai Shek. And there were a lot of raiders. I don't know that they had just one table, but Davey was at the table, and they had a Doolittle raider, a beautiful Chinese woman, Doolittle raider, beautiful Chinese woman, all the way around the table. And it is said, I don't have it confirmed, but this is too funny not to tell you. Jimmy Doolittle's sitting there, and there's a beautiful Chinese woman sitting next to him. And he says, "Where are you from?" She looks at him, she says, "Chicago, and I wish the hell I were there right now." I hope that's a true story because I've told it so many times. And I just keep telling it, and I'm going to keep telling it. So Davy Jones survives the Doolittle raid. He gets back somewhere where he's trained, probably in the US, and he's getting ready to go to North Africa and do more fighting. More fighting, more bombing, more chances to have problems, and he did it. He flew a B-26. Some of them call it the Widowmaker, but I put that it's the Marauder. I thought that was pretty nice. And if you look in this picture, the puffs of smoke is flak. Sometimes it's black, and it's a mortar that comes out of a flak gun, and it breaks apart. Some of the airmen told me they had 300 holes in their airplane when they landed. Can you imagine? I mean, and it would take out an airplane. They could take out an airplane, I think, at 28,000 feet. Maybe it was 18,000 feet. But they could certainly take out airplanes quite well. So here's Davy Jones on one of these aircraft on a bombing mission to Bizerta, Tunisia. And they get shot down. And they crash land. Although everybody's okay, they're kind of wounded, but they're immediately captured. And he is taken to Europe. He ends up at a prison camp called Stalag Luft III. How many of you have seen the movie The Great Escape? Oh, lots. Well, this is the prison camp where it occurred. Initially, so this camp held 10,000 men when it was fully full of POWs. This right here, oh, I've got a little thing here. This right here is East Compound, and it was Commonwealth soldiers, and so was much of this because we were just getting into the war in North Africa. This one here became an American. It was, this is East, Center. This is North Compound where the Great Escape occurred. And I think this, or one of these two, is Block 104. Now, they didn't call their barracks anything but their block. I don't know why. But Davey was in North Compound for a very long time. This compound, this remained a Commonwealth compound, and then Americans were moved here when sufficient numbers. In 1943, lots of POWs, lots of Americans came in. Then they built West Compound, and in June of 1944, I think 5,000 American airmen came into this camp. And it was only an officers' camp. They got green death soup, and one man said that, you know, he's sitting there the first day in prison camp, and he's picking out the maggots, and the green soup just did nothing for him. And one of his other buddies ate it. And the next day, he couldn't eat the green death soup. And they said to him, you know, by tomorrow, you're going to be hungry. So the next day, by Jove, he was eating the maggots and the whole thing. But they usually they hated, when they were done with Stalag Luft III, when they were out of Stalag Luft III, few of them liked to eat cabbage, kohlrabi, and a lot of foods because they had to. And they were old, they were filthy, they were really tough, and none of them really appreciated the food. We were lucky that the Red Cross gave them foodstuffs. It was about 14 pounds of food with salmon, and they had klim, which was milk spilled backwards. It was powdered milk. They got fake, well, it wasn't fake coffee, it was dried coffee, but they could barter the guards. They could get them to do things for them, because if they gave them a cigarette or they did something nice, like gave them some food or a candy bar, a D-bar, they could then have that guard under control. Because he didn't want his commander, the commander of the camp, to know that he'd done that, because he'd be sent somewhere where he'd probably die. I was talking to somebody a little while ago, and they said, well, have you ever watched Hogan's Heroes? And men from Stalag Luft III were actually on the set for that TV series. So what you're seeing, I mean, there was no Schultz and there was no, Klink, and, their guards were not that nice, for sure. But a lot of the clandestine things that they did, they were seen on that TV program. And so when you watch it, it's very funny. And it's really black humor if you think about it. And that's exactly what the prisoners of war had to have, because, I mean, Davy Jones was in this prison camp for 2 years and not quite 4 months. He ended up at another prison camp. So it was 2 years and almost 1 month, and then 3 months in another prison camp. But it was the Ritz of prison camps, unlike the Pacific or unlike what the sergeants experienced. Sergeants that were in Stalag Luft IV, they were forced march. When the Russians were coming in, they were forced march, and they walked between 400 and 600 miles in 82 days. And they ate bark off of trees, frozen vegetables out of the farmers' fields. They drank filthy water because it was in the ditches that ran along the road, and they had no opportunity not to, because that was it. When Davey was in the North Compound, they were building three underground tunnels to get out of. Davey and Ed Tovey and Bob Ingram, all three of them are the only Americans that dug on Tunnel Tom. Now, this is Tunnel Harry, but because this is a tunnel that they use. But by the time this tunnel was opened, those guys were in the South Compound, and they couldn't be an escaper. If they had, they would have been killed immediately, because they couldn't speak German. They didn't know how to be a German. I mean, the way they write, they put the date of the year, or the date of the month, and then the year. And so they could tell implants when they wrote like that. That was one signal that escapees, when they were with them, when they saw that, they knew. But you can see, so it was underground. Davey told me that when he was in Tunnel Tom one time, they went down with maybe just not very much clothing on, because they'd go down 40 foot, and this was 30 foot deep and 400 foot long. And so they built the tunnels very, very deep, because the Germans were planting microphones in the soil. They were listening. They'd crawl underneath the barracks and listen, trying to find out what was going on. They would pour water all over the soil, thinking they knew where the tunnels were, because it would collapse them. And you can see, so it looks so nice and clean in there. I'm sure it didn't look like that at all. You can see I don't know what they're thinking about here. I'm not sure if this is something full of soil, because they take the soil out, and then they'd have people who had a flight suit on, and they would put big pockets in it and fill it with soil, and then they would pull a little piece of a stick or something out, and these people would walk along and, shuffle that soil back into the ground. The pump you see here, someone came to, it was called the X Committee. That was their escape committee. And there was MI9 was the British group that created, what they were doing in there, all the clandestine operations. The British were very kind in that they shared that with the United States, and the United States created a unit called the OSS, the Office of Strategic, right. And so they were both doing the same thing, Strategic Services, OSS, Office of Strategic Services. And the reason that they wanted the Americans doing it, because everybody in Stalag Luft III, they wanted them forced to try and escape. The guy who had the idea for this, his name was Roger Bushell. He was a South African, And he wanted to get as many men out as he could, because the more men you got out, the harder it was for them to know who was out. I mean, they could count everybody. They could go and get their names, and they could find out, but it was very slow. But these escapes, they pulled lots of Germans off the front lines, and that's what they were trying to do with their escape. So they were fighting the war from the inside, basically. So I start to tell you about this pump. They were finding that down 30 foot, and as long as they were going, the air wasn't very good. And they would put a candle in there, and when it went out, they knew they had to leave because they didn't have enough. So they used milk, you heard me say clim milk. They would take those and stack them and make it be the way that the air came in, and then they would pump that back and forth and back and forth. And someone gave them a magazine where they showed how to build this pump, and they created this pump that would continually bring air into the tunnel. Here is just a waiting station, and there's one here, and then you can see here where it comes up. You see that it's not in the forest, it's in front of, and that was the downfall. The night, it was March 24th and 25th, and it was short, just, I don't know how many feet, but not very, the distance was very short. And they're sneaking these guys out, and they had to pull a cord, and the sad part about it is every inch of that camp, or of that tunnel, they had to use boards that were underneath their bunks. And their bunks they had boards like I don't know if they're 1x8 or, but they were not very big boards. And they were the whole bottom of their bed, so they would take every other one, and they had a burlap mattress filled with sawdust. Well, it felt good the first day, but that was about it. So everybody gave up something, but very few were in the clandestine operations. And they had it all the way around. They would notch it, so they would notch it, notch it, and notch it. So the entire tunnel was full of these boards. They stole, if an electrician came in, or if somebody came in and left a hammer or left something else, like he left electric wire, well, they put it in there and had electricity. Go figure. I mean, these were some of the smartest men the U.S. had, truthfully, and they really did come up with some incredible ideas. This is what Stalag Luft III looked like in the wintertime. It was dismal, it was very cold, it was in Silesia. So if you look at Germany in World War I, on the northeast side, which is now Poland, it was called Sagan, S-A-G-A-N, Germany. And that whole area, the ground is full of sand. And that sand makes glass. And so that's what it's known for. So everywhere, on the topsoil is black, but underneath it's sand. And part of the reason they had to put those boards in was it propped up. They're 30 foot underground. They need to prop it up. You couldn't be alone when you were in Stalag Luft III. You were always with someone. Usually there were lots of arguments, and your letters were the most prized things. People put them near their heart. They opened them so many times and would read them that they would just tear. And sometimes when men were in the camp and they got a letter, here's one. Dear John, this is from his fiancée. Dear John, got tired of waiting for you. I met your dad. We spent some time and fell in love. We got married. Love, Mom. Well, you can imagine, it's funny but so cruel. You can only imagine how that man felt. Would he want to talk to his dad again? Would he want to, it just was, it was so cruel. So this was just really, they would pull up those logs for heat because they needed heat. They were cold all the time. If one person got sick, everybody got sick. The food was horrendous, and living there was trying. One of the men, his name was Jack Kapmeyer, he went down on the Schweinfurt mission in October of 43, and he said, You couldn't give me $1 million to do that again, nor could you give me $1 million to take it away from me. Because they had time to think. They had time to wonder what they wanted to be. They had books in there. They had, the Red Cross provided them with a lot of things. They had, it was called a Kriegi log, and it was a diary, and they were called Kriegsgefangenen, which just means prisoners of war, and they called themselves Kriegis. But how long can you do that? You're there for 2 years and a month, or you're shot down July 4th, 1942, and you're there almost 3 years. The Russians were coming, and they were about 12 miles east of Stalag Luft III. Adolf Hitler wanted to kill all of the pilots. He thought that was a really good idea, and his generals said, oh no, we can't do that. It's just too much. And so instead of killing them, they force-marched them. The South Compound were the first, the Americans were the first out. It was the coldest winter on record. The snow was blowing, it was deep. These men didn't have the right clothing, they didn't have the right shoes, they froze their feet. Some of them just laid down and died. Some of them they'd pick up and throw in a wagon and take them. Some nights they got to sleep in a barn and they woke up and they had fleas all over them. One guy said, those little bastards were all over me. But they just kept going. And Davy Jones did all of this as well. But he had to carry clandestine things that he had. And I'll tell you in a minute what it is. But he was with the X Committee in North Compound before the Great Escape. He was in South Compound when was breached. And Roger Bushhill got in touch with with Big X, which was General Bub, well, he was Colonel Bub Clark at the time, and said, don't mess it up, basically, and told them what they were doing so that they knew on the 24th and 25th of March that the escape was going to happen. But this is a drawing from Lester Hall, who was a POW. He was in an airplane that got blown apart, and he was on his back when he woke up. His parachute was on, thank God. He pulled the cord, and he was able to survive. But he drew all of these wonderful drawings in his Kriegi log. And I said to him, did you ever draw after the war? And he said, never again. But you can see the guard says if you don't get up, you may die. They may shoot him. He may just lay down and die. People helped a lot of people to try and make it through. And look at Davey. You can see how thin he is. You can see his eyes look like they're really dark underneath. And it was hard on him. It was really, really hard on them. But what did you have? These men were resilient. And I think when you give up your resilience, you're more likely just to give up caring. And you've got courage, you've got resilience. And I think they also learned to just kind of deal with their adversity. Now, they didn't come home perfect, but when you look at your adversity and see the value of it, you can accept it and move forward. And I think a lot of them did that as prisoners of war. So when the Russians were coming in, they marched them to a place where they got to sleep in a brick factory. And they turned the heat up so high that the Germans were afraid, the guards were afraid they would burn it down. So they turned it down, but all of them got to be warm for the first time in many days. And then they moved them west to a town called Spremberg. At Spremberg, they gave them a cup. Now, everybody had to have their own cup or their own whatever it was, cup of barley soup. And many of them said it was like food from the gods. And then they shoved them in a 40-8. A 40-8 is just a wooden rail car. They're normally green, and then 40 means 40 people or 8 horses or 8 cattle or whatever. And they crammed them in. They defecated in their clothes. They could barely breathe sometimes. A lot of people were ill. They were vomiting, and they had dysentery. And they were moved from from Spremberg in northern Germany all the way down almost to Munich, but they were taken to Moosburg, which is southeast of Munich. And they walked into a camp that was built for 40,000 people. It had between 120 and 130,000 men in it. The food was non-existent. They were bartering for food. They would eat just about anything. The latrines were overflowing. The guards, they'd say, "You get out here, we're going to count you," and they didn't care. My uncle said he sat on his bed if he had to urinate, and and not everybody had a bunk, but my uncle did, and he sat on his bunk, and he would just think about having to go to the bathroom and having to just getting the energy to even stand up and go and take care of himself. And that was how it was for many of them. Now, Davy Jones was carrying money because he was little X in South Compound with big X, who was Colonel Clark. He was in charge of all the escape money. And so he went out, poured water in, and dug it all up and carried it with him, when instead he could have carried food or warm clothing or whatever. And upon liberation, which was April 29th, 1945, General Patton's Third Army fought the SS all around the camp. The men thought they were coming in, and all of a sudden the fighting started, and they were on the ground hoping they didn't get shot, and they got liberated that day. One of the fellows I knew quite well, who knew Davy Jones quite well and took some of the pictures, he was standing on the fence when the Americans broke the gate down. A tank came through, and everybody just jumped on it. And my uncle said he turned around and saw 10,000 men cry. Another fellow, an Irishman, was holding on to the fence, and next to him was another fellow named Charles. And the swastika flag went down, the American flag went up. And the Irishman said to the guy next to him, "I hope you not think me unpatriotic, but that's the damnedest, most beautiful flag I've ever seen." And so you wonder why they wanted our country to be prosperous. You wonder why they wanted, and there were lots of POWs. Now this is one for you. One of the POWs said to me, we fought the war. Well, first we survived the Depression, we fought the war, and then we were prisoners. And we came home, and we wanted our children to have everything. Who has tried to give their children everything? Who has tried to give their children everything? We have got to stop. And I thought it was just interesting. He told me that, and then several others did. And so I guess I like to remember that just for myself, if not for somebody else. Davy Tokyo Jones. When he was in prison camp and doing clandestine operations, he wasn't Davy Jones, he was Tokyo. And that's where he got that nickname. And he still, I think for me, he will always be Davy Tokyo Jones. Not David, but Davy. I had the good fortune in 1995 to travel to Stalag Luft III with 125 former POWs and 200 members of their family. Now, it happened because my grandmother died, and my uncle, who was a prisoner in Stalag Luft III, he kept talking about, after the funeral, he kept talking about wanting to go back and to the prison camp for the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of their liberation. And he kept saying it, and finally I got tired of hearing it. I said, "Well, Uncle, why don't you just go?" And he said, "I need someone to do the marketing materials." Well, I was a graphic designer, did marketing. I think he knew that. And I said, "Well, I'll help you." And he said, "Will you have a free trip to Europe?" Now, I am not one to not take a free trip to Europe. I will do that anytime anyone wants to offer me that. So we sent out 3,000 letters to POWs, and they started calling me and asking questions about the trip. And then they left me with a story. And I thought, oh, well, I'll go and take my recorder and I'll record these guys. And here I am on a bus the first day in Berlin before the next day we went to the prison camp. And this woman, we're on Den Lindenstrasse, which it just means Linden Street. There's all kinds of linden trees on that street. And she's talking about this beautiful lamppost that's in front of us. And we're sitting there listening, and this man leans over to me from his seat, and he says, "You should have seen the American airmen hung by piano wire from that lamppost." It took my breath away. I could see the rubble in the street. I could see those dead men hanging with their, and I could only imagine his fear. And it was then in 1995 that I decided that I had to record them. I had to tell their stories. So I've been doing this since 1993, and I never tire of it. Although I'm going to finish something very, very wonderful in the next couple of years that will have all of my archive on it. I've got the largest collection of Radio Tokyo letters. I've got almost 200 oral histories from these men, and some from Baton Death Marchers, and just a lot of people that need their story told. And I think all of us should interview our family members, our parents, even our children, and just have their voices that we can listen to when we want to remember, or when they're gone and we can't. And you know, most of the men that I've interviewed, they're all gone. I can't call them and ask them questions anymore. I can't, go to a reunion with them, or go to one guy. He ended up working for NASA, and oh my gosh, his story was just unbelievable. I mean, and I'm the luckiest person in the world because I was able to talk to them. And I will leave it at that.